At the beginning of 1942, the Eastern Front had reached a critical point. The offensive on Moscow had stalled. The winter, Soviet resistance and logistical problems had slowed the German advance. What was supposed to be a lightning war turned into a war of attrition. Hitler needed a new plan. His strategy, Operation Blue. The objective was clear: to secure the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the energy supply to the Red Army. To do this, Army Group A would advance south, while Army Group B would head to the Volga to protect the flank. Stalingrad, located on the route, was not a priority target, but it would soon become the epicenter of the battle. At the beginning of the offensive, the German advance was overwhelming. The motorized divisions covered great distances, outpacing an enemy still in the midst of reorganization. The Luftwaffe devastated factories and defensive positions, but every kilometer traveled weakened the supply lines. The troops began to show signs of exhaustion, and the Red Army strengthened its defense. The Sixth Army, under the command of Friedrich Paulus, crossed the Don and approached Stalingrad. For Hitler, the outcome of this campaign would determine the future of the war. On August 23, 1942, the sky over Stalingrad darkened. From dawn, waves of German bombers, Junkers Ju-87 and Heinkel He-111, dropped tons of explosives over the city. In a few hours, 40,000 people died. Underground shelters collapsed with those inside, while fires consumed entire neighborhoods. The Luftwaffe had reduced the city to rubble. The waters of the Volga, illuminated by the flames, looked like a river of fire. After the aerial devastation, the German infantry advanced, convinced the city was a smoking graveyard. But among the ruins, the Soviets resisted. Destroyed factories and buildings became improvised fortresses. Every basement hid snipers, and every collapsed wall concealed a machine gun nest. The fighting no longer had defined lines. The German tanks, designed for rapid movement, became trapped in a tangle of rubble. The mechanized advance turned into a disadvantage. The fight was reduced to hand-to-hand combat in narrow hallways and destroyed buildings. The Sixth Army was not facing a conventional battle. What had begun was called a rat war. With no possibility of retreat, every man had to fight to the end. Supply lines stretched longer, and the wear began to show. Meanwhile, the Red Army reinforced its defenses and hardened its resistance. The Luftwaffe, without clear targets, bombed indiscriminately, unable to distinguish between allies and enemies. The battle for Stalingrad was only just beginning. The Soviet forces resisted amid a devastated city. The 62nd Army was at its limit, units were fragmented, and defensive lines were collapsing. German artillery struck relentlessly, and reinforcements were slow to arrive. General Anton Lopatin assessed the situation and concluded that Stalingrad could not be held. Upon receiving the report, Stalin immediately dismissed him. In his place, Vasily Chuikov assumed command in September. His strategy was not based on static defense, but on turning Stalingrad into an environment where German superiority was neutralized. He ordered combat to be brought to close quarters, eliminating the advantage of artillery and the Luftwaffe. The ruins of factories, underground passages, and improvised shelters transformed into fortifications. Positions were dug within collapsed structures, and every corridor became an ambush zone. The fighting turned chaotic. The Soviets no longer awaited enemy assaults from fixed positions. They attacked and vanished among the rubble. Chuikov created hidden routes between buildings and deployed snipers at key points. Sappers mined strategic access points, forcing the Germans to pay a high price for every meter gained. Communications with the opposite bank of the Volga became increasingly difficult. By the end of September 1942, the situation in Stalingrad was unsustainable. The units of the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies, overwhelmed by the German offensive, tried to hold their ground in Red Square, one of the last strongholds in the city center. But the pressure was unbearable. The defensive lines collapsed. Without ammunition, without reinforcements, and without clear orders, panic seized the soldiers. Many abandoned their positions and ran toward the docks in a desperate attempt to cross the Volga. What began as a retreat turned into a stampede. Amid the chaos, NKVD commissars enforced discipline with summary executions. Applying Stalin's order, 227, not one step back, they shot anyone attempting to abandon their position. There was no room for fear or retreat. On September 22nd, a German armored column broke the Soviet resistance in the city center. The 42nd Special Brigade was annihilated. Of the thousands of men who made up the unit, barely 20 remained alive. The panzers advanced without opposition along Kurskaya and Kievskaya streets, occupied Moskovskaya Avenue, and reached the Tsaritsa River. There, they destroyed the ferry connecting to the eastern bank, leaving the defenders without an escape route. The enemy was less than 100 meters from the Volga. Stalingrad was on the brink of collapse. The Germans controlled almost the entire city, reducing Soviet resistance to a narrow strip of land between the rubble and the river. Every day, German artillery relentlessly pounded the last Soviet positions, while the Luftwaffe harassed any attempt to cross. The Volga had become a corridor of death. On the other side of the river, the scene was just as bleak. The docks were crowded with wounded, disoriented soldiers and desperate civilians trying to escape. Most would never make it. Soviet command posts were relocated to Golodny Island, but access was nearly impossible. The barges set off overloaded and barely managed to advance before being hit by enemy fire. Despite everything, the Soviet defenders still holding out on the western bank did not yield. For days, they repelled up to 7 German assaults, entrenching themselves in the ruins and fighting with what little they had. German artillery and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers relentlessly struck their positions. The fire lit up the city. The river, stained red, continued carrying bodies downstream. The Volga had become a deadly trap. Under the faint light of dawn, bodies drifted among the wreckage of shattered vessels. On the eastern bank, 10,000 soldiers of the 13th Guards Division waited silently. They knew what awaited them. They had to cross the river under German fire and reinforce the last Soviet positions in Stalingrad. There was no alternative. If the city fell, the Volga would be the last line of defense. The barges and fishing boats set sail in the twilight. They had barely moved away from the shore when the sky lit up with enemy fire. German artillery unleashed a deluge of shells. Explosions sent columns of water and fire into the air. The crossing turned into a massacre. Cannons, mortars, and machine guns swept the vessels. Some sank instantly, others drifted, engulfed in flames. A direct hit blew up a gunboat, killing about 20 crew members. Despite the casualties, the others kept advancing, dodging shrapnel and the blood-stained waves. When they reached the shore, Rodimtsev and his men leapt into the mud and the still smouldering ruins. There was no time to regroup. The enemy was in front of them, firing from fortified positions. Without waiting for orders, they charged the assault, forcing the Germans to retreat about 100 meters. The fighting was hand-to-hand. Grenades, bayonets, and point-blank shots defined each confrontation. The Germans took refuge behind a station and the destroyed factories. Bullets ricocheted off the bricks. Every meter was won with blood. In 24 hours, the 13th Division was practically annihilated. Of the 10,000 men who crossed the Volga, more than 7,000 died. Barely 3,000 remained standing, but there was no rest. For those who survived, the Battle of Stalingrad had only just begun. The survivors of the 13th Division had no time to regroup. They had barely set foot on land when the order came to advance toward Mamayev Kurgan, a strategic hill overlooking Stalingrad and the Volga. The Germans had taken it on September 13th, consolidating a key position for their artillery. From there, they coordinated attacks and directed the advance of their infantry. As long as the hill remained in their hands, the Soviets would be under constant fire. Recapturing it was essential. Soviet troops still maintained crossfire from the east side of the river, where artillery pounded the streets in an east-west direction. However, the north-south routes were under German infantry control, who secured passage with sustained fire. Every movement in the city was conditioned by control of the hill. Zhukov knew it could not remain in enemy hands. The 13th Guards Division, freshly arrived after crossing the Volga under enemy fire, received the order to recapture the height at any cost. Casualties were already high, but if the Germans fortified Mamayev Kurgan, Stalingrad would fall. On September 16th, the Soviets launched their offensive. That same day, the 13th Guards Division began the assault on Mamayev Kurgan. The Soviets advanced through rubble and craters, facing an enemy entrenched at the top. There was no room for maneuvers. The fighting was direct and ruthless. Bayonets, grenades, and point-blank shots decided every position. Every meter cost lives. The Germans launched up to a dozen counterattacks daily, supported by artillery and air bombardments. The Soviets responded with nighttime assaults, infiltrating trenches covered with corpses. Machine gun and mortar fire turned the hill into a mud pit of blood and shrapnel. On September 24th, after several desperate attempts, the Soviets managed to take the summit, but control was fleeting. 3 days later, the Germans retook the position, forcing the defenders to entrench themselves on the slopes. The bombing craters became improvised shelters where they resisted under relentless fire. With the arrival of the 284th Rifle Division, the Soviet line stabilized. Nights were a hell of surprise attacks and hand-to-hand combat, where knives and shovels became weapons of last resort. On September 30th, the Soviets recaptured part of the hill, but the Germans held the summit. On October 10th, new assaults reignited the battle. Mamayev Kurgan continued changing hands. The explosions never ceased. The ground was covered with craters and shrapnel. At the beginning of October 1942, the Germans controlled almost the entire city. The train stations, the financial district, and much of the barricade and tractor factories were in their hands. However, the Soviets continued resisting. The fiercest fighting was concentrated in the industrial areas. The tractor factory and the Red October metalworking plant became fortresses. Underground tunnels connected Soviet positions, allowing defenders to reappear behind Nazi lines and launch unexpected counterattacks. From partially destroyed buildings, machine gun nests swept the streets, halting the German advance without armored support. Every day reinforcements crossed the Volga, but the crossing was a death sentence. The Luftwaffe and German artillery attacked relentlessly. Many soldiers died before setting foot on land. Still, the order was clear: Stalingrad must not fall. On October 14th, 150 tanks from the 14th Panzer Division, escorted by Stukas and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, burst into the tractor factory. Explosions shook the complex, devastating the outer trenches. The Soviets evacuated 3,500 wounded from a field hospital, while Chuikov's command post was relocated to avoid destruction. Troops rotated constantly, but the newcomers barely survived a few hours before being annihilated. Buried T-34 turrets served as improvised bunkers, forcing the German infantry to fight at close range. On October 16th, the Barricadi factory became a slaughterhouse, with the Germans advancing amid mortar fire and artillery explosions. The fighting did not cease. The city continued to burn. The fighting did not cease, and the city continued to burn. Every day, thousands of soldiers fell on both sides. The German Sixth Army lost up to 2,500 men, while the Soviets saw as many as 6,000 die. The streets were covered with decomposing bodies trapped among rubble and snow. The stench of death permeated every corner of Stalingrad. Winter arrived with its full severity. By the end of October, the city was buried under a layer of snow, and the temperature dropped below -18 degrees. The German troops, without adequate clothing, shivered from cold and hunger. Bread rations were reduced to 100 grams per day, forcing soldiers to feed on horse meat and rats. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases decimated them as much as the enemy. From his bunker, Chuikov showed no mercy. Officers who mentioned the possibility of surrender were executed immediately. Without enough soldiers, he sent thousands of inexperienced recruits to charge the German trenches, where they were massacred by machine guns and artillery. Meanwhile, Soviet forces continued receiving reinforcements and supplies from the Volga. The attrition favored the USSR, while the German troops, exhausted and out of ammunition, could no longer sustain their offensive. Explosions continued lighting up the ruined city. By mid-November 1942, the German Sixth Army occupied most of Stalingrad. The Red Army was cornered against the Volga, resisting in small defensive pockets. However, the calm was an illusion. The Soviets were preparing a devastating blow. On November 19th at 7:20 in the morning, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers, 800 tanks and 13,000 artillery pieces began the attack. Katyusha rocket launchers and heavy mortars hammered Romanian positions, destroying trenches and communication centers. The Romanian troops, Axis allies tasked with protecting the German flanks, were poorly equipped and lacked sufficient support, becoming the most vulnerable point in the line. The first blow fell in the north. The Third Romanian Army, lacking modern anti-tank defenses, was crushed by the advance of the Soviet 5th Tank Army and the 21st and 65th Armies. Axis positions collapsed within hours, leaving the Romanians in retreat and the Germans unsupported on their flanks. The next day, the offensive spread south. The 51st and 57th Soviet armies, led by the 13th and 4th Mechanized Corps, broke through the front of the 4th Romanian Army at Beketovka. The Axis defenders, outnumbered and without armored support, quickly crumbled, opening a critical breach in the encirclement. On November 22nd, both Soviet forces met at Kalach-on-Don, closing the trap. 290,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Romanians and Croatian auxiliaries, were completely encircled. The Soviet troops, using captured German vehicles, advanced to the Kalach Bridge, taking it by surprise and securing the final closure of the encirclement. On November 23rd, Stalingrad was completely surrounded. 22 Axis divisions trapped in the city were without supplies or any chance of escape. On November 24th, with Stalingrad completely surrounded, Hitler ordered von Paulus to hold out at all costs and forbade any attempt to retreat. The order was clear: The city had to be held at any price, with no consideration for withdrawal or escape attempts. The German High Command announced an airlift to supply the Sixth Army, assuring that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily. The reality was very different. In the first days, they barely managed to drop 117 tons daily, an amount insufficient to feed hundreds of thousands of men. The Luftwaffe was not prepared for this mission. Of the 500 available aircraft, many were twin-engine Ju-52s, incapable of operating without proper escort and too slow to evade Soviet fighters. The Soviets exploited the German vulnerability. In the first 48 hours, 22 transports were shot down, further reducing supplies. The problems only worsened. The cold continued to increase, food reserves disappeared, and exhaustion weakened the troops. Casualties were not only counted on the battlefield, hunger and disease were killing more soldiers than enemy bullets. On November 27th, the Soviets consolidated their siege lines. With each passing day, the ring tightened further. Von Paulus awaited reinforcements, but help did not arrive. On December 12th, 1942, von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, with the objective of rescuing the Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad. The 4th Panzer Army, under the command of Hermann Hoth, began its offensive from Kotelnikovo, southwest of the city. The plan was to open a corridor to the besieged troops, but the advance depended on von Paulus attempting a breakout from the encirclement. Hoth advanced with the 6th Panzer Division and Romanian units, managing to penetrate the Soviet lines at the Aksai River. Inside Stalingrad, German soldiers heard the echo of artillery in the distance and believed that help was near. However, Hitler refused to authorize a retreat, dooming the success of the operation. By December 15th, Hoth's forces reached the Mishkova River, positioning themselves 65 kilometers from Stalingrad. The Soviets reacted immediately, sending the 2nd Guards Army under the command of Rodion Malinovsky. Resistance intensified, and the German advance began to slow. Attrition, lack of supplies, and extreme cold weakened Hoth's troops. From inside the encirclement, von Paulus and his Chief of Staff, Arthur Schmidt, rejected any attempt to break out, citing shortages of fuel and ammunition. Without support from within, the offensive lost momentum. On December 23rd, Hoth halted his advance, and the 6th Panzer Division tried to hold, but the Soviets launched continuous attacks, forcing them to retreat. On December 16th, the Red Army launched Operation Little Saturn, attacking the 8th Italian Army on the Don River. The Italian troops, poorly equipped and weakened by the winter, could not withstand the assault by the 1st Guards Army and the 5th Soviet Tank Army. By December 19th, several Italian divisions had been annihilated, and Army Group Don was in danger of being encircled. Manstein ordered the offensive to stop and a retreat. The 4th Panzer Army pulled back, and the last hope of freeing Stalingrad disappeared. By January 1943, the 6th Army was on the brink of collapse. Ammunition and food reserves had practically disappeared, and aerial supplies barely covered a fraction of what was needed. The soldiers, weakened by starvation and disease, were falling without the need for gunfire. The streets and bunkers were filled with abandoned corpses, while the stench of death permeated the air. Morale had collapsed. Orders were no longer being followed, and many soldiers took refuge in the ruins, awaiting an inevitable end. Others tried to desert, but the Feldgendarmerie executed those who were caught. Some resorted to self-mutilation to avoid continuing to fight, while in the most desperate spots there were cases of cannibalism. On the 30th of January, on the anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler promoted von Paulus to Field Marshal. It was a sentence disguised as an honor. No officer of that rank had ever surrendered. From his bunker, Paulus ignored the hint and stayed with his general staff while the city crumbled around him. On the morning of the 31st of January, the last communications ceased. The German troops, divided into small pockets of resistance, could no longer coordinate. The 11th Army Corps in the north and von Paulus's headquarters in the south were completely isolated. That same day, the 64th Soviet Army, led by Mikhail Shumilov, launched the final assault on the city center. The German lines collapsed without ammunition or reinforcements. The Soviet advance was unstoppable. Before dawn, Soviet soldiers stormed the basements of the large Univermag department stores where von Paulus and his general staff had established their headquarters. He was captured without resistance. Hours earlier, Hitler had promoted him to field marshal, hoping he would commit suicide rather than surrender. Paulus ignored the hint and refused to take his own life. Although already in enemy hands, he refused to issue a formal surrender order, leaving each commander to decide on their own. Meanwhile, to the north of the city, General Karl Strecker's forces continued fighting, even though they knew all was lost. On the 2nd of February, surrounded by 4 Soviet armies, Strecker finally surrendered. His last radio message made no mention of Hitler, only leaving one phrase, "Long live Germany." 91,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, including 22 generals. Many were sick, malnourished, or severely wounded. Thousands died during the forced marches to the prisoner of war camps. Only between 5,000 and 6,000 would return to Germany more than a decade later. The 13th Guards Division, led by Alexander Rodimtsev, had endured the impossible at Stalingrad. From Mamayev Hill to the October Revolution factory, his men fought relentlessly. But the war was not yet over for them. After the victory at Stalingrad, the unit continued fighting on the Eastern Front until the fall of Berlin in 1945. For his role in the battle, Rodimtsev received his second decoration as Hero of the Soviet Union. The sacrifice of his division was etched into the history of Stalingrad, where every street and every ruin spoke of the brutality of the battle. The landscape after the victory was desolate. 99% of the city had been razed, leaving only the Barmely fountain standing. 100,000 civilians died during the siege, and the survivors spent months living among the rubble. Volunteers and Axis prisoners of war were used to clear the ruins, and in 1961, the city was renamed Volgograd. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility had been shattered at Stalingrad. The Red Army took the initiative on the Eastern Front and would not stop until Berlin. The German defeat convinced the Western allies of the Soviet Union's resilience, consolidating the coalition against Hitler. At Stalingrad, Germany suffered its greatest defeat in the Second World War. The losses were catastrophic. Between 1,100,000 and 1,300,000 Soviet casualties, while the Axis lost more than 800,000 men, including both dead and prisoners. From Stalingrad onward, the Wehrmacht was only able to fight in retreat until its final surrender in 1945.